Good evening and welcome to Spring Global on Western Spring Television. Now the headlines. Hoodlums attacks supporters of Labour Party in Lagos. Turkey President Recep Erdogan vows to begin rebuilding cities in hard-hit southeast region within weeks. Spain to offer citizenship to 222 Nicaraguan political prisoners released earlier this week. My name is Evelyn Ohiola. We begin with politics, as some supporters of the Labour Party presidential candidate Peter Obi have been attacked by hoodlums in Lagos State as the standard-bearer holds his final campaign rally in the state. It was gathered that the supporters were attacked with machetes and other objects as they made their way to Tafawa Balewa Square, where the rally is being held. Medical personnel at the square had their hands full as they attended to the injured. Videos and pictures shared on social media also showed some individuals with bruises, as well as vandalized buses and cars purportedly deployed to transport supporters.
What does the bus look like?
Unbranded bus.
Unbranded bus.
But
two Fanagon buses. Okay, but do you know, can you describe what they look like?
Just normal town.
Cutlass and gun. Okay, Lagos, Nigeria. We just want to tell you that there are some people right now attacking our people.
Outside Nigeria, the Ethiopian government has restricted access to social media platforms in the country following violent protests sparked by a rift within the country's Orthodox Church. The protest broke out in the Oromia region when three church officials declared themselves archbishops last month and set up their own governing body. While some demonstrators have opposed their move, others have supported it. The internet watchdog NetBlocks on Twitter said access to Facebook, Messenger, TikTok and Telegram has been severely restricted, citing network data it had collected. The tweet came hours after the church said at least 30 people have been killed in the protests since February 4th. The church's statement called for demonstrations on Sunday against the new governing body as it accused the Ethiopian government of meddling in the church internal affairs. Outside Africa, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has vowed to take concrete steps to begin rebuilding cities in the hard-hit southeast region within weeks. Mr. Erdogan made the statement as he announced the latest death toll in the country, which had risen to 21,043, stating that hundreds of thousands of buildings were uninhabitable across southern Turkey. Mr. Erdogan also condemned those who have looted or committed other crimes in earthquake areas, adding that they would be punished by the state. He said during a visit to the disaster zone that the people who are involved in looting or kidnapping should know that the state's firm hand is on their backs. World Health Organization Chief Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus has arrived in Syria's quake-stricken city of Aleppo. Mr. Tedros arrived at the Aleppo airport to tour some hospitals and shelters with Syria's health minister and the governor of Aleppo. Aleppo in the northwest of the country is controlled by the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. In the meantime, the United Nations says more than 5 million Syrians may be homeless after Monday's devastating earthquakes that struck the country and its neighbors, Turkey. The Syria representative of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Ivanka Danapala, disclosed this, stating that as many as 5.3 million people in Syria may have been left without a home. It reveals that for Syria, the crisis is within a crisis, stating that the country is already dealing with economic shocks, COVID, and are now in the depths of winter with blizzards raging in the affected areas. Survivors of the magnitude 7.8 and 7.6 quakes have flocked to camps set up for people displaced by nearly 12 years of war from other parts of Syria. British and German rescuers have found and pulled to safety a 15-year-old girl in the devastated Turkish city of Kahramanmaraş. More than 24,000 people are now known to have died after Monday's earthquakes in southern Turkey and northern Syria. Syrian state media say Damascus has now given permission for international aid to be sent to earthquake victims in rebel-held areas across government lines. Currently, there is only one open crossing from Turkey to Syria, through which 2 UN convoys have so far been able to enter rebel-held areas. To the Russia-Ukraine war, the head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has said that Russian forces must capture the strategic Ukrainian city of Bakhmut to proceed with their war campaign. Mr. Prigozhin, in a rare interview made public yesterday, said Russia had to establish clear goals in its nearly year-old war on Ukraine. He reveals that the goals should include the firm establishment of its presence in eastern Ukraine or push forward to capture more of the country. Mr. Prigozhin stated that Bakhmut is needed so Russian troops can operate comfortably, but the troops are facing fierce resistance from Ukraine, with the Ukrainian army sending more and more units. Wagner mercenaries, many conscripted from prisons in Russia, have played a large role in the war in Ukraine, particularly last month when they captured the town of Soledar near Bakhmut. Elsewhere, France's foreign ministry says an Iranian-French academic has been released from jail in Tehran after spending more than 3 years in prison. Fariba Adekar was given 5-year jail term in 2020 for conspiring against national security and 1 year for propaganda, which she denied. Her university's Sciences Po in Paris announced the news with happiness and relief, although it is not yet clear when Ms. Adekar will be released. Supporters of Ms. Adekar have always vehemently denied the charges she has faced, saying that the academic been unjustly in prison. Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi has denounced enemies for sparking unrest in the country and the region during a ceremony to mark the 44th anniversary of the 1979 revolution that birthed the Islamic Republic. In a televised speech to crowds at the Azadi Square in Tehran today, the president remained defiant in the face of critical West on the establishment's response to protests that began in September last year. Nationwide anti-government protests focusing on the country's mandatory hijab covering for women was ignited after a 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died in the custody of morality police on September 16th. Mr. Raisi re-emphasizing Iranian authorities' claims that the West and its allies have been behind the country's unrest, said the country's enemies failed to stop its progress, so they turned to the project of chaos that is said they have also tried to implement in neighboring Iraq and Afghanistan. You're watching Spring Global on Western Spring Television. We will be back after this break.
Aminatu, the legendary Queen of Zazzau, is best known to historians as Queen Amina of Zaria, an old walled town and capital of the Hausa state of Zazzau. Amina was a great warrior and the first woman to rule the ancient kingdom of Zazzau. Her 34 years as queen witnessed an unprecedented expansion of Zazzau by conquests. Queen Amina of Zaria belongs to the class of Amazons by the might of her army and her strings of conquests. She opened Zaria to trans-border trade and was said to have initiated kola nut cultivation in the ancient kingdom. The Hausa Muslim figure was born in 1533 and died in 1610 at the age of 77 years. Folklores remember Aminatu, the Queen of Zazzau, as a brave, smart and talented leader whose giant statue now adorns the National Arts Theatre in Lagos Lagos, Nigeria, while many educational institutions bear her name. Western Spring Television identifies Queen Amina as a watershed character in history. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was an anti-apartheid activist who gave his all for the elimination of what has been described as the world's most vicious rule of the unjust and man's inhumanity against man. He was born July 18, 1918 in Mvezo, South Africa. Educated and trained as a successful legal practitioner, he took up the gauntlet of a human activist against segregation by the minority white suprematists in South Africa. At the climax of his trial for treason, orchestrated by the minority South African government, the great crusader for democratic equality was prepared to pay the supreme sacrifice to establish majority rule in his native land. He told white jurists that if achieving freedom for his people was worth his life, he was prepared to die. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in Robben Island, described as the most notorious prison in the world. It was from this same prison that he came out as a free man to assume office as South Africa's first black president in 1994. Western Spring Television identifies Nelson Mandela as a watershed character in history.
Welcome back. Moving on, Spain says it is willing to offer citizenship to more than 200 Nicaraguan political prisoners released earlier this week after legislators aligned with Nicaragua's President Daniel Ortega moved to strip them of their legal status as citizens. Spanish Foreign Minister José Manuel Albares announced the decision yesterday, a day after 222 political prisoners were freed by Nicaragua and sent to the United States. The former prisoners include opposition leaders, journalists, and religious figures spoken against Mr. Ortega's government. In a statement on Thursday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken welcomed the release as a step toward addressing human rights abuses in Nicaragua. However, the Ortega administration described the prisoner release as an effort to remove criminals from within Nicaragua's borders, deriding the prisoners as agents of foreign powers. Similarly, the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken has spoken to his Nicaraguan counterpart Denis Mokanda in a rare high-level contact between the two countries. The call yesterday came a day after Managua released 222 political prisoners arrested in crackdowns in the wake of anti-government protests that began in the Latin American country in 2018. The move has been seen as an attempt by President Daniel Ortega to begin to repair ties with the U.S., with relations severely deteriorated in recent years. In a brief statement released after the call, U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Prince said Blinken and Mokada discussed the prisoners as well as the importance of constructive dialogue. President Joe Biden ordered a fighter jet to shoot down an unidentified high-altitude object off Alaska yesterday. White House spokesman John Kirby said the unmanned object was the size of a small car and posed a reasonable threat to civilian aviation. Mr. Kirby said the object's purpose and origin was unclear. It comes a week after the American military destroyed a Chinese balloon over U.S. territorial waters.
So I can confirm that the Department of Defense was tracking a high-altitude object over Alaska airspace in the last 24 hours. The object was flying at an altitude of 40,000 feet and posed a reasonable threat to the safety of civilian flight. Out of an abundance of caution and at the recommendation of the Pentagon, President Biden ordered the military to down the object and and they did, and it came inside our territorial waters. Those waters right now are frozen, but inside territorial airspace and over territorial waters. Fighter aircraft assigned to U.S. Northern Command took down the object within the last hour.
Still in the U.S., the United States has blacklisted 6 Chinese entities it said were linked to Beijing's aerospace programs as part of its retaliation over an alleged Chinese spy balloon that traversed U.S. airspace. The move is likely to further escalate the diplomatic row between the U.S. and China that intensified due to the surveillance balloon which the U.S. eventually shot down last weekend. The U.S. said the balloon was equipped to detect and collect intelligence signals, but Beijing has insisted it was a weather craft that had been blown off course. Yesterday, the U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security said the 6 Chinese entities were being targeted for their support to China's military modernization efforts, specifically the People's Liberation Army's aerospace programs, including airships and balloons. Meanwhile, the Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and United States President Joe Biden have promised to kickstart relations between the two countries. The pledge came during a White House meeting between the two leaders, the first since Brazilian President, commonly known as Lula, took office in January, replacing far-right leader Jair Bolsonaro. Mr. Lula and Mr. Biden highlighted shared goals during the visit, with Mr. Biden agreeing to visit Brazil in the future. The meeting came just over a month after Mr. Bolsonaro's supporters stormed the Congress, Supreme Court and the presidential palace on January 8, demanding that the military intervene and remove Lula from office. The riot paralleled the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021 by supporters of former President Donald Trump seeking to overturn Mr. Biden's victory.
Spoke in January, I affirmed my commitment to our relationship, and when we spoke about our mutual agendas, it sounded very simple. I affirmed the United States' unwavering support for Brazil's democracy and respect for the free world represented. We're the 2 largest democracies in the hemisphere. Brazil, the United States stand together. We reject political violence, and we put great value in our democratic institutions.
Elsewhere, the mayor of Canadian city Toronto has resigned unexpectedly after admitting to a relationship with a former staff member. John Tory's announcement came shortly after the Toronto Star newspaper reported he had an affair with the 31-year-old woman whom it did not name. It said the affair started during the COVID-19 pandemic and was ended mutually by consent this year. The 68-year-old called the relationship a serious error in judgment.
Matter. During the pandemic, I developed a relationship with an employee in my office in a way that did not meet the standards to which I hold myself as mayor and as a family man. The relationship ended by mutual consent earlier this year. During the course of our relationship some time ago, the employee decided to pursue employment outside City Hall and secured a job elsewhere. I recognize that permitting this relationship to develop was a serious error in judgment on my part. It came at a time when Barb, my wife of 40-plus years, and I were enduring many lengthy periods apart while I carried out my responsibilities during the pandemic. As a result, I've decided that I will step down as mayor so that I can take the time to reflect on my mistakes and to do the work of rebuilding the trust of my family.
The United Nations Human Rights Chief Volker Turk has urged the international community to consider deploying a specialized armed force to Haiti. Mr. Turk made the appeal in a video posted on social media yesterday at the end of a 2-day visit to Haiti, warning that violent gangs are creating a living nightmare for thousands of people. Mr. Turk said it is time for the international community to help Haitian authorities regain full control so that the suffering can be stopped. He stated that since multiple crises around the world are competing for attention, the situation in Haiti is not receiving the urgent spotlight that it deserves.
Behind us, you can see neighborhoods where gangs control territory and population. 500,000 children live in these circumstances. You cannot imagine. It's living hell. They can't go to school properly. They are not comforted by their parents because their parents are afraid of what's going to happen to them next day. 20,000 people are in catastrophic famine-like situation. It's so important that we put the spotlight on this impossible situation for the most vulnerable, most marginalized people that live here in this country.
In the world of sport, former Chelsea player Emerson Palmieri scored against his former club to end West Ham a point and increase the pressure on Blues boss Graham Potter. Chelsea fielded a new-look £200 million forward line, but despite taking the lead, were once again frustrated and have now won just once in 7 Premier League matches. João Felix had already had a goal ruled out for offside when the Portuguese forward fired the Blues ahead with a volleyed finish. Kai Havertz, 30, had doubled the lead, only for Chelsea's celebrations to be caught short by another offside flag before West Ham equalized through Italy international Emerson's first Premier League goal. Chelsea, who have dropped 14 points in the last 7 top-flight matches, carved out the better chances but could not make them count. Before we end Spring Global, here is a recap of our top stories. Some supporters of the Labour Party presidential candidate Peter Obi have alleged attacks by hoodlums in Lagos State as the standard-bearer holds his final campaign rally in the state. Turkey President Recep Erdogan has vowed to take concrete steps to begin rebuilding cities in the hard-hit southeast region within weeks. Spain says it is willing to offer citizenship to more than 200 Nicaraguan political prisoners released earlier this week after legislators aligned with Nicaragua's President Daniel Ortega moved to strip them of their legal status as citizens. You can follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Western Spring Television. You can also watch us live on our YouTube channel at Western Spring Television. I am Evelyn Ohiola. A very good evening to you.